Hi.
Okay. Perfect. Oh, thanks so much for helping make this happen. Okay, should we just get right into it?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, our special issue is on forgiveness. So I thought you'd be perfect for that. So my first question is, in your experience, what makes forgiveness possible?
Well, thanks so much for thinking about me and including me in this conversation. So, I'm a therapist
Yeah.
and I've been a professor of trauma. I work a
Mhm.
lot in responding to gendered violence and other
Mhm.
forms of state violence as an activist and stuff like that. For me, I remember being taught by Janella Bird,
Mhm.
Johnella Bird from Aotearoa, New Zealand. She was teaching a workshop on trauma, and she said forgiveness is the F word in therapy. That
Huh.
so much of therapy was about sending, in particular, women and non-binary people who'd been harmed by, for the most part, masculine identified people, men, certainly in those structures of
Mhm.
patriarchy, that therapy was about getting them all ready to go back in the world and face more abuse and shit and violence and
Yeah.
forgive the perpetrators, that was the goal of therapy. And a lot of the talk was if you don't forgive, they own a part of you and all this stuff.
Mhm.
So I started off, not being very enamored of the idea of forgiveness. But
Mhm.
I've also, but as aside from being a therapist, I'm a prison abolitionist, and I worked against the death penalty 30 years ago. That's what I was doing, kind of big,
Mhm.
not ever paid, but really
Yeah.
full time with my life. And I worked for like 20 guys on death row in the United States, all of whom were
Mhm.
executed. Um,
Yeah.
and that really informed my thinking, not necessarily about forgiveness, but about repair and restoring humanity to people and to the complexity of seeing people beyond just being perpetrators. Certainly, forgiveness is not even a possible or not in the dialogue in the carceral punishment systems, not just in
Mhm.
the United States, but in Canada as well. So for me, I believe that like forgiveness itself is pretty problematic when it's decontextualized and weaponized, I think, against really oppressed and harmed people.
Mhm.
But I think the ideas of repair and integration and receiving people, kind of building a bridge back to the community, the human community people have been thrown out of because of particular acts. I think um, in those situations, I believe that that kind of repair, when you can have accountability and repair,
Mhm.
then I believe people can have something that might smell like forgiveness, which is I think about as not wanting something punitive or harmful or violent to happen to another person.
Mhm.
I think forgiveness itself is an extremely complex concept, and taken outside of the political structures in which it can happen. It's just a politics of niceness, and it's in particular a pretty white middle class woman thing. Who gets to apologize? Who gets to
Yeah.
forgive people who
Yeah.
aren't structurally harmed? So it's right. A lot of people
Yeah.
have to climb a mountain of work addressing all the harms, the context of harms they've been in before they're in any kind of place to make repair with a person who's perpetrated in a moment against them.
Mhm.
That's a really long, complicated answer, but it's just
No.
simple, right?
Yeah. No, I'm so glad you said that. That was one of my concerns when we decided to do this theme. I'm like, because my defense instincts just go up. I'm like, why do we have to forgive?
Because
Um,
that's the question. It's not just why do we have to forgive.
yeah.
If we back that up, starting who has to forgive, who's
Yeah.
legally required to forgive, is
Mhm.
feminine identified people. Like women have an
Yeah.
obligation to forgive. Trans folks have an obligation to. They've got to go to therapy now and do the hard work to get to forgive.
Yeah.
Right. That's
Yeah.
the problem in terms of gendered violence in particular. But also, if we look at it in terms of class, and look at it in terms of racism, it's people who are victimized by the state. People of color, Black people, Indigenous people need to have forgiveness against the state for state violence, colonialism. Like
Yeah.
the imperative of forgiveness is always, when it's imperative, it's always wielded by white supremacy in the state.
Mm-hmm.
You know, who gets to, yeah, and who is seen as a bad person for not forgiving, right? Whereas
Yeah.
there's some masculine whether, no matter what, as Bell Hooks teaches us, right, Black feminist scholar from the United States, um, it's not your gender or certainly not your biology that makes you, you know, doing feminism or doing masculinity, or sorry, doing patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Discern patriarchy from masculinity. But if you're doing domination and control, it doesn't matter what your gender is, you're doing um, patriarchy. And so there's these spaces, patriarchal spaces, right, where you're like, I'll never forgive those bastards, I'll hold on to this my whole life, and it's kind of like a point of pride. So
Yeah.
it's very political who is required to forgive and who is allowed to withhold forgiveness as a virtue, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
that's always gendered, classed, racialized, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I remember that workshop you did for us at SFU Women's Center. You were talking about reconciliation, and you said, how can you reconcile mass rape and genocide?
Yeah.
So yeah, I never forgot that.
Yeah, I think Riel Dupley Rossi, who's a Mohawk scholar, we alongside Charlene Helson, we wrote a booklet, um, a zine really on decolonization called
Yeah,
Disrupting Current Colonial Practices and Structures. And one of the
yeah,
things that Riel quoted me in here, I was honored to be in this way, is that,
yeah,
you know, that I had said, in the words of Vikki Reynolds, 2019, you don't reconcile you don't reconcile genocide, you
yeah,
stop it. This idea
yeah.
that, you know, we've got these forgiveness terms like reconciliation. To reconcile means to go back to a harmonious time. And there was
Mm-hmm.
no harmony between
Mm-hmm.
indigenous people and invaders who perpetrated genocide, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a romantic fiction. And I think
Yeah.
that that is also true about heterosexual marriage and the state's ideas of that, that, you know, if there's violence in a relationship, they should go to marriage counseling and reconcile it. And it's like, what if it started with violence? What if this woman was kind of coerced through domination, through economics, through not wanting to be a woman without a man, like into
Mm-hmm.
that forced state union marriage, right?
Yeah.
That heterosexual marriage itself is not a very liberatory practice for uh, for women and non-binary people in particular, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Next question is, what does a genuine apology look like?
Thanks for that. So you know, I have been really informed, of course, by the transformative justice folks, you know,
Mm-hmm.
women of color in particular, indigenous women, Black women. I'm thinking about Miriam Kaba, who wrote, you know, we do this till we free us. Angela Davis's work on freedom is a constant struggle. And I think about Insight, you know, women, gender nonconforming, and trans people of color against violence. They, you know, and then groups like Mimi Kim and Rachel Herzig from Creative Interventions from the Bay Area. So all of what I'm going to talk about is really informed by direct action activism and all of these,
Mm-hmm.
brilliant, for the most part, women of color, Black women, Indigenous women.
Mm-hmm.
When I, as a therapist, when I started my work 30 years ago, I was working with young boys. They were called young men, but they were boys who had been violent in their families, mostly against their mothers. And they
Mm-hmm.
were arrested and taken out of the home and, you know, sent to a place where we did therapy with them. You know, as soon as I say that, Natasha, that all those boys were poor. None of them had
Mm-hmm.
a lawyer, you know, and their mother, and for the most part, they were on welfare, living in poor housing and state housing. Um, and their mothers weren't believable when the police showed up to try to keep their sons in the house. Rich
Yeah.
moms can say things like, "Oh, the neighbors just called because, you know, we were watching an action movie, or there was a little,
Yeah.
you know, they just like, oh, he's got to get up early for his piano lessons." And all of this class and white and money privilege helps
Mm-hmm.
them keep their child from being criminalized, right? But
Yeah.
the youth I was working with, they didn't have those repairs against the state. And I'm not saying they shouldn't be accountable for what they're doing, but you know, we worked towards repair. But the first thing I just wanted to start with is, before like an apology, this idea that, you know, those young boys, for example, they didn't invent violence.
Mm-mm.
in context, like the Aboriginal young men, who were a lot of them, all of them were on welfare in inadequate housing. That's violence. The structural violence in which they're living is never named. But the police action starts with what that young boy does when he hits his mother, you know.
Mm-mm.
But it doesn't start when all those kids, all those young ones that I work with, you know, violence was perpetrated against them and they witnessed violence perpetrated against their mothers, as you well know. That's
Yeah.
where they learned violence. They didn't, no young guy I've ever worked with invented violence. And they were in all this state apparatus of violence that never gets named in this. So the first thing that I do in terms of moving towards an apology is you've got to acknowledge the violence, the structural violence that incident happened in. That youth is responsible for their actions, but they're not responsible for the fact that they've seen their mother sexually assaulted and violated. They've been in the violence of poverty. They've got more, you know, they are over policed and underprotected. You know, the police
Mm-hmm.
are most likely to call social workers and have them apprehended as opposed to ever save them from some violence. It's state violence they're really up against, that
Mm-hmm.
necropolitics and structural abandonment. I'm giving you a long answer, but
Got
you have
it.
that long work of repair to get to a real apology. So for me, this is what I've kind of come up to, a little bit of a map of
Mm-hmm.
apology. The first thing is you have to name what you did
Mm-hmm.
in real language. Alan Wade from the response-based practice talks about using words to put words to deeds, like who did what. So, you know, in
Yeah.
the naming of what you did is that I hurt you, I hit you, like I did this thing to you, without any kind of saying because you whatever. Really naming the harms that happened. But the second part of it, so the first one is naming what you did, but the second thing is you have to take responsibility not just for what you did, but for the potential impact and consequences that you made possible in this world. And this comes to me, I believe, from the teachings of Alan Jenkins, a therapist in Australia who worked with men who used violence. He wrote two important books in the 1990s, Invitations to Responsibility and Being Ethical. Invitations to Responsibility is such a different, it's already anti-carceral. It's saying we're not calling the cops, we're not looking for
Mm-hmm.
punishment, we're looking for accountability and repair. So the first part of the apology was naming what you did in clear language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Second one is taking responsibility for potential impacts and consequences. For example, you know, any man who hits his wife, for example, you know, she may fall on the ground and have a concussion. He's responsible for that. But
Mm-hmm.
many men murder their female partners, especially when female partners leave them. And you know, it's more than a woman a week now.
Mm-hmm.
This has gone up, right? It's more
Yeah.
than a woman a week, and certainly during COVID, it's gone up. During major sports events, it goes up. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but more than one woman a week is murdered in Canada by a male partner or former partner. If a man, you know, hits a woman and her head hits the table on the way down, she can be dead. So he's not
Mm-hmm.
just responsible for hitting her; he's responsible for hitting her and very potentially killing her.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to really map out all those potential consequences that happen. And when we talk about like the consequences that happen, so now a man has hit his wife. She's got to go to a shelter. Her kids are going to be shunned at school. His whole family won't talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
The little kid Billy is going to go to his piano recital, and his grandmother is not going to be there because his mom is a bitch and she's lied about, you know, the grandmother's son. Like
Mm-hmm.
these consequences are enormous. And when you get a whiteboard out and you map the real consequences, and this is something I do when I work with men, the real consequences of let's think about every person who is impacted about you hitting your wife. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just her and you and all of your children, all of your friends, all of your extended family, and the work sites and everything else. And then what are the impacts on these folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's you have to be. It's very tender to do that work because that's where I worry that, in particular, men who are trying to take responsibility might think about ideas of suicide because it
Mm-hmm.
seems so. If you truly map out how much consequence there is here, it's
Mm-hmm.
enormous. That's what we have to repair. And I'm willing to walk alongside men to repair all of that. when you involve the police and you go to the justice system, they're only responsible for that one act, and it all becomes about punishment. There's no repair. So that third piece is about working to make repair. How do we start to repair on that? And you start with, ethical practice for me means you track vulnerability. So who's most vulnerable in this whole experience, Natasha, are the children. So even before the female partner, you've got to make it better with your kids. Then we've got to make it better with the partner. And that doesn't mean that she needs to accept an apology or anything. Make repair might be that she never wants to see you again, get out of the way and make sure she doesn't move into poverty. We're not talking about everything's going to be like happy and sweet at the end. In terms of the hard work of making repair, I'm also informed by the 12-step movement, Alcoholics Anonymous. And
oh yes.
there's real problems with that movement, but there's fabulous things. And I truly know and believe that they've saved more lives from, quote, addiction than counseling has, right? And I say that as a person who's taught therapy. But what the 12-step program says is, in terms of that making repair, you do absolutely everything humanly possible that is not illegal to make repair. That's how far they want their community to go. And they hold their community members and help them do that. I think that's like a piece of transformative justice organizing. That's really community-based. No cops involved, no social workers, no legal agreements or any of that kind of stuff. Just an obligation you're going to be held to by people who love. So then you do the work to make repair. And then you have to have a real plan to not do it again. And that is massive work. That is more work than the accountability work. And then you have to do the fifth stage, which is the hardest one, which is you have to not do it again.
Yeah.
Actions that are the things that happen. So the first one is naming what you did. Secondly is taking responsibility for all consequences and the potential consequences. The third one is actually doing the work of repair. And the fourth one is having a real plan to not do this again. And the fifth one is not doing it again, actually walking your talk with action. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. You've already kind of hit on this, but in case you want to add to it, what kinds of power and privilege relations need to be kept in mind when we forgive or choose not to, or when we want to be forgiven?
Oh, thanks so much for that. So I think, let's just think about this. And someone who has, perpetrated, and I don't want to talk, I'm not using the language of perpetrator as an identity category, just in this event, who did what to do. Often people want forgiveness, and that's not up to you. It's up to the person who's experienced the harm to decide whether forgiveness is a piece of what's important for them. And so often forgiveness is such a liberal, apolitical value in our societies that people are up there. People's goal in therapy is to get forgiveness. It's like, so your goal is for someone else to do the hard work, to climb a mountain, to get back to you. That's not a therapy. We're not fucking doing that.
Yeah. Someone recently told me, you have to forgive me. I'm like, I can't forgive on command. It doesn't mean anything if I do.
Yeah. Well, here's the whole thing in terms of power. Violence is always an abuse of power. So it's an abuse of power to require someone to accept apology. An apology is a very gracious act on the part of the person willing to receive it. So, and I just think, so like that third part of the apology stuff about the work of doing repair, you have to do the repair whether the person you've harmed wants an apology or not, whether they're ever open to hear it, and whether they are ever open to forgiveness. That you are required for your own humanity and ethics to do that work. And it just may be, and often it is, a lot of the men that I've worked with in the downtown East Side are men who had long prison sentences, often really hurt their children and their female partners. And their kids never want to be with them again, never want to see them again. Now, we have to check and make sure that that's actually true, because social workers, the police, in the prison industrial complex, that system always tells people there's no way back and there's no forgiveness for them. So we can't trust that system at all. But we have to find out. But if someone's children and ex-partner don't want that forgiveness, don't ever want to hear that apology, then part of the accountability is making sure you're never near those people again. That's a way that a man can be accountable, by not giving an apology. by
Mhm.
making sure they don't run into their children again. If what their children need is to be safe and what they want is to never see their dad again, then it's up to that dad to make sure he never sees those kids again. You know, like,
Mhm.
but you're asking a different question, which is about the power when there is an
Mhm.
apology, and forgiveness when we're moving. So forgiveness, I think we've got to always be aware of the power that's involved in all the contexts of violence, structural violence, necropolitics, like all of that context that I was talking about in which this act happens, right? And so the politics of forgiveness is, you know, when that one thing I think about, for example, is a woman who's moved to poverty when a man leaves the family.
Mhm.
For her, accepting an apology might be total bullshit, but an act of resistance. She'll let him apologize because she needs him to start to send checks.
Yeah.
House. Like, don't fool yourself that, you know, if what you're after is an apology and that's something that you need, who is centered here? I guess that's what I would say, Natasha.
Mhm.
Again, ethical practice, not just in therapy, but in community work and in the work of repair, in restorative justice, um, yeah, in the work of repair, you got to track vulnerability, say who's most vulnerable and center those persons. So it's the people who experience the violence. They get to decide if they want to move. Is forgiveness something that they want? If that's not something they want, it shouldn't happen.
Mhm.
And that, yeah, as you said, people saying, you've got to forgive me. We've all been in experiences, whether
Mhm.
it's a person talking to us or whether we've transgressed and just feel like, oh, you're about to forgive me.
Mhm.
My way back to my humanity, my way back to my picture as a decent person integrated in society with relationships is all hinged on your forgiveness. That's not
Mhm.
okay. That
Mhm.
is an abuse of power. That's
Mhm.
actually demanding something of someone that you harmed. You don't get to make the demands now. They
Mhm.
might make demands of what is required for a repair, but
Mhm.
that's not hinged on, and then I'll forgive you. They might never forgive you. I remember doing a circle with young women, all of whom had been sexually exploited and experienced sexual violence from men. The stuff we call drug and alcohol counseling, which
Yeah.
always it you know almost always involves violence against young women, right, and
Mhm.
structural violence and stuff. But I remember being in a group with those young ones a long time ago, and one of the youth, one of the young women, said to me, "Vikki, can I just get you? I just want to everything you're saying. I want to play a song." And so she came in and she played a song by Lauryn Hill. And I believe it was the album, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill.
Yeah.
And in that song, Lauryn Hill was singing as a Black young woman to Black young men. And she says, brothers, I mean, I'm got this wrong.
Yeah.
She says something like, brothers, I am going to forgive you, but I will never, never forget. And
Mhm.
so that's one piece also that I also attribute to Janella Bird's work, this supervisor from Aotearoa, New Zealand, who talked about if we move with forgiveness, what happens is in our society under, you know, just basic patriarchy and all those other power structures, colonialism, all that. You have to forgive and forget, don't you, Natasha? Forgive and forget,
Mhm.
salt and pepper.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
I'm, you know, so forgiveness is one thing. I teach young women to not forget. You
Mhm.
can forgive if that's something that's useful for you. We'll talk about the costs of not forgiving, and the
Mhm.
benefits of forgiving. But like, or is this something you even want? But the forgetting part, let's talk about the costs of forgetting.
Mhm.
Because what I believe is that if I just use the scenarios I've been working about, um, you know, young women have a knowing in the bones. They have a bodily wisdom of the body that comes from experienced violence.
Mhm.
I don't want them to forget that. I want them to hold on to everything I call their spidey sense. Everything
Yeah.
that lets you know this is not going okay. When we do forgive and forget, you never talk about this stuff again. You pretend it didn't happen. I actually think that that's gaslighting,
Yeah.
especially the imperative, you know, young women and young non-binary people, especially of color, especially poor, especially Black and Indigenous, are really required to forgive.
Mhm.
You're supposed to, that's your big job. You start forgiving before you even understand like oppression or have any analysis of that.
Mhm.
And in that forgiving, how much is forgotten that actually sets people up again. So I think, again, if we're going to use an ethical, you know, an ethical map and center most vulnerable people, forgetting is a really dangerous act that doesn't center people who've been harmed. So I want to like center that. So I think, so I think like, let's be very careful that forgiving doesn't get conflated with forgiving and forgetting. So, and Lauryn Hill's, I'm gonna forgive you, but I will never ever forget.
Yeah.
She wasn't talking about I'm on to you, I'm gonna get the cops on you at all, because like many Black women, I believe she would not throw another Black man under the bus. The last thing, you know, in most of the communities, most of this work on repair comes from communities, queer communities, trans, refugee communities, direct action activists, Black, Indigenous, people of color activists, and communities who never call the cops. Who, you know, if your first thought when you call the police is, oh, they're thinking of my safety, you have an extremely privileged life. You're probably white middle class and straight and legal and not doing direct action activism. But for many of us in all of this transformational work, you know, that we don't think that the police, you know, I definitely did not grow up thinking, and you know, here's what I learned in the East End of Toronto, where I grew up with a very criminalized, poor community, struggling community, was if you think any situation can't get worse, just call the cops. Because any situation can get worse for somebody, right? So communities who have never relied on the police and have always known that we're over policed and under protected have always tried to take care of themselves, right? And so this repair work has always been going on in communities who have not wanted to involve the state because, like I said, that's just punitive and carceral. Now you have someone victimized by the state, and you get held responsible as the person who put them there. I'm thinking right now about death penalty work. You know, the states mostly in the United States is where I've done death penalty work, where the state says, you know, we're going to kill this man for you, Natasha. He killed your son, so we're going to kill him for you. And you're like, I actually don't want him dead. And they're like, yeah, we don't need to talk to the victims. We're going to be tough on crime. They just, so that, and I think that that's very telling for us in all of our work in trying to make repair for harms as well. What are the politics behind the requirement for forgiveness? Who is benefiting from that and who is paying for that? And those are good questions, again, that come from people like Angela Davis in her anti-carceral state, a lot of feminists of color.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any situations where forgiveness is not possible?
Well, I think it's entirely contextual and personal, depending on those human beings. I've worked with all kinds of people to forgive people who have harmed them, who have died, who are gone. I think that I think forgiveness is a very hopeful thing if it is actually ethical and not required and not like part of the politics of politeness or part of the subjugation of, in particular, feminized and gender non-conforming bodies and people. But I think forgiveness, if the person who is harmed feels that forgiveness is a part of their path, I think there's always a way.
Cool.
Always a way.
Okay, and this next question we can skip if you feel like you've already answered it. Sometimes there's pressure to forgive. Can you speak a bit about this? Is forgiveness something we can request from another person or group?
I think, like, so I've said a lot about narratives for forgiveness, but in terms, I will address that question. Is it something that we can ask for? I think that's something you want to really consider, not by yourself, but with others in community. If you have done harm, would it be okay? You know, Natasha, imagine you and I were in a public situation and I fat shamed you. Or we're in a public situation and you shamed me about, I don't know, a fat shaming. You know, just it's, you know, I'm trying to think of what would be possible to happen to you know, something like that. Maybe that's not a big enough thing, but maybe it is. I think that you would need to talk with other folks about, oh my God, I'm so, like, you could tell me that you're sorry, or something that you could repair easily, something where you have to do the work of repair. Like, cut that, forget that, those are bad examples. If I really transgressed against you and our relationship, we're in relationship with each other. There's one thing I will say, I don't know where you'll fit this in. If the if the harm was public, the repair has to be public.
Hmm.
You know, so here's what happens in university classes. A prof will say something that like really humiliates one student.
Yeah.
And then at the break, like fat shaming or something like that, or saying,
Yeah.
you're black, you probably know about this, you know,
Yeah.
like just something that says, okay, yeah, I'm the black student in this class. He didn't need to actually out me about that, but
Yeah.
I feel awkward and outside. Why would I know more about incarceration? You know, it's a racist, anti-black sentiment.
Yeah.
And then what happens is at the break, when the student goes by, the prof says, oh, can I talk to you for a second? Like, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to say that. So what they're doing is it looks like an apology, it looks like repair, and it really requires forgiveness because of power. That student is going to get marked by that teacher. So they have to say, oh yeah, Dr. Reynolds, it's nothing. I totally get it.
Yeah.
But that it's totally an abuse of power. You can't, and so here's what I think. If what would need to be happening in that situation is that the professor would have to apologize to that person in front of the whole class and then do all the work about talking about how harmful that is and where that came from. And then what else and what other harms has that, you know, student, maybe that black student faced in every class going, like, look at it, like it would be big work to repair that actually. I think absolutely required. And I have done things like that. And it doesn't matter if we're supposed to be teaching grief and loss counseling or whatever, you need to break the whole thing down and talk about white supremacy because it's in the room all the time. So I think that, so I want to say, like, if the harm is public, the repair should be public because you didn't just harm that person, you've affronted that whole community and there's other harms.
Yeah.
But tell me your question again.
Sometimes there's pressure to forgive. Can you speak a bit about this? Is forgiveness something we can request from another person or group?
But I think when you're in intimate relationships with folks, and it you know, you really want that forgiveness, you need to think about why you want that forgiveness. Here's what I think. I think therapy is a really problematic thing. It is definitely not a neutral thing. And so many people who've caused harm use therapy, especially in court, especially if you're moving to the carceral punishment system. They go to therapy to be able to present a story that they've done the work that they deserve to be able to apologize and be forgiven. So in that sense, it's totally weaponized. Right. So I think you got to think about why is it you feel that you have any right at all to ask for forgiveness. You have to do the hard work of that, and then to think about whether or not somebody would be willing to have that. That's a negotiation, and it might involve other people to have that conversation. I have helped fathers apologize to their children and ask forgiveness. In my early work as a family therapist, but because the child wanted to forgive their dad, they wanted their dad in their life. And basically what it came down to is what would you need to have to feel like it was safe and whatever. One thing was for him to do all kinds of work on repair, if particularly the not doing it again action piece. After the not doing it again action piece, Natasha, the conversation about whether or not you can ask for forgiveness can come up, not before. I should have said that right away. You got to do all pieces before you do that. And those children, you know, had their, because that's what they wanted, had their father on his knees asking them to forgive them because they were all ready to forgive. They had done what they needed to do to forgive. And it was meaningful for them. And it allowed them to have even just supervised visits with their father again. But they got to have their father in their life again. That child shouldn't lose having a parent in their life because of that parent's actions. If that youth wants that, right? So I think it's all, again, there's no real maps for this. I think there's ethical parameters, right, that are centered on what the person who's been harmed needs and wants, and the other person doing the accountability work. What happens too quick, of course, is we move right to apology and the real work. So most of the burden is on giving forgiveness, not doing the work of apology, right?
Yeah, well said. Often in talking about forgiveness, we assume there's a victim and a perpetrator. How do we go about repairing damage when it's more complex than that? So when both parties have caused harm and been harmed, or when there are more people involved?
Yeah, I think the reality is violence is extremely complicated, right? And
Yeah.
I'm very concerned because of the carceral system and the punishment system. I'm really concerned about terms like perpetrator and victim.
Yeah.
You know, in the anti-violence sector, we've been fighting women called victims since forever. Survivor's not a whole lot better. Some people like it.
Yeah.
Um, but I think most often there are histories of violence, and there's histories of transgression and histories of harm.